So the tragic effects of World War II were even more widespread than those of World War I. More than 30 million had died and another 40 million had been displaced. Many European and American artists in the immediate post-war period of the 1940s and 50s really tried to use their art to come to terms with what they had experienced. Now, while European art was really disrupted by the turmoil of World War II, the United States kind of recovered more quickly, and New York became a refuge for European artists, gradually developing into this vibrant, progressive, modern art center. Dada, Surrealist, Expressionist, and other avant-garde European artists altered the character of the American art scene, but especially in New York, artists ultimately developed their own uniquely American artistic identities. The term abstract expressionism refers to a fairly loose group of artists working in New York City in the 1940s and 50s who were unified by their common desires to express their profound social alienation after World War II and make a new kind of art. Abstract expressionism was really the culmination of early 20th century European expressive tendencies, from the Fauves and the German expressionists' attempts to free color from its natural role, to the simplified geometric abstraction of De Stijl and the International style. These artists combined a high degree of abstraction with emotional qualities to communicate the anxieties and stresses of living in wartime and the immediate post-war period, as well as their rebellion against the conformity of 1950s American society. Clement Greenberg, an American formalist art critic, meaning he valued form over content, he urged these abstract expressionists to consider their works autonomous and completely self-referential objects. He argued that the best paintings made no reference to the outside world, but instead had their own internal meaning and order. Many abstract expressionists were particularly drawn to the organic, biomorphic abstraction and automatism of surrealism, and they sought to create non-objective imagery through spontaneous, improvisational actions that would unleash the artist's subconscious mind and allow creativity to flow freely. But where the Surrealists had sort of looked to Sigmund Freud's theories of psychoanalysis, many abstract expressionists were instead drawn to the theories of the Swiss psychoanalyst Carl Jung, who described a collective unconscious of universal archetypes shared by all humans. And so these artists kind of sought to embody those universal symbolic forms. But they also argued that each artist should really develop their own individual identifiable style. In their idealized view, a painting was a record of an individual artist's psyche at the moment of the painting's creation. And so as the movement progressed, several of these artists developed increasingly personal, individual symbolic languages. So overall, abstract expressionists were really united by two common commitments. The first was their interest in the traditional history of painting, but also their desire to rebel against it, including against the recent ideas of European modernism. And the second was their desire to treat the act of painting on canvas as a self-contained, expressive, and even heroic exercise that would communicate universal ideals. The most famous of these abstract expressionists is probably Jackson Pollock. Born in Wyoming, Pollock moved to New York City in 1930. He battled alcoholism and mental illness from an early age. Pollock was aware of Carl Jung's ideas about the power of visual imagery to unlock psychic feelings and memories for mental health, and he underwent psychoanalysis between 1939 and 1942. Between 1948 and 1950, Pollock remained sober, and it was during this period that he produced his most celebrated works, but he relied heavily on his wife, the artist Lee Krasner, for support during this time. Pollock embraced improvisation and chance within his works, moving steadily towards pure abstraction. Once, when asked why he did not work from nature, he allegedly replied, "Because I am nature." He developed a distinctive method of automatic painting by placing a large, unstretched, unprimed canvas on the floor, and then he would fling, splatter, drip, and pour paint directly from the can or tube while moving around the canvas, working from all four sides with his entire body. Through practice, he learned controlled bodily gestures that allowed him to create loops, curls, splatters, and puddles of different character and really build up this sort of dense web of continuous lines rather than the broken marks of individual brushstrokes. This bodily control, along with his awareness of the characteristics of his materials, including the viscosity or the sort of way that it flows when thinking about different types of paint, these things really allowed Pollock to claim technical sophistication within his quick, spontaneous compositions. Where many people saw his arcs and whirls of paint as simply chaotic, he saw them as, quote, labyrinths that led viewers along complex paths and into organic, calligraphic webs of natural and biomorphic forms. In 1950, Time magazine referred to Pollock as Jack the Dripper, and in 1952, the critic Harold Rosenberg coined the term action painting to describe the approach of Pollock and others who made dynamic marks of paint using various improvisational techniques. The word action stresses the individual process or physical activity of painting rather than the finished product. The physicality of visible strokes and marks kind of records the creation process and the actions of their artists and their tools. So this 1947 work, titled Full Fathom 5, is the combination of splattered commercial enamel paint and oil paint squirted directly from a punctured tube, with careful attention given to the different qualities and the textures of the materials. Here, as in several of his works, he's also embedded small objects, including cigarette butts, nails, thumbtacks, buttons, coins, and a key. The items here are obscured by paint, but they really contribute to the work's dense and encrusted appearance. Titles of abstract expressionist works, they typically are rather non-specific and self-referential, and that includes most of Pollock's works, but this one's a bit different. Art historian Carolyn Lochner explains that, quote, at the time Full Fathom 5 was painted, Pollock was particularly insistent that each of his canvases was possessed of its own life, independent of any specifically descriptive function. Nonetheless, he had no objections when a neighbor proposed that he adopt a line from William Shakespeare's The Tempest as the title of his new painting. The nearly complete verse reads as follows: Full fathom 5 thy father lies, of his bones are coral made. Those are pearls that were his eyes. Nothing of him that doth fade, but doth not suffer a sea change into something rich and strange. So this verse in Shakespeare's play, The Tempest, it's spoken by the character Ariel as she describes a death by shipwreck. The incorporation of objects from his everyday life into this thickly painted surface kind of echoes the transformation of the human corpse underwater within the story, and the remnants of past experiences and actions are therefore transformed into something entirely new. Many of Pollock's works, as well as those by other abstract expressionists, are quite heroic in scale. For example, his work Autumn Rhythm No. 30 from 1950 is 9 feet tall and over 17 feet wide. This huge format allowed room for sweeping, rhythmic, gestural lines and splatters of color that engulf the viewer's entire field of vision. Pollock was careful to limit his color palettes, and he really demonstrates that awareness of materials, creating a considerable variety of textures and line qualities with different applications of paint. Notice here how he creates some marks that are more angular and maybe even geometric with sort of straight flicks of paint. And then others are really more organic, kind of flowing lines. And so it seems he's kind of separated those two along color lines, with the more geometric shapes done here in beige, and then the more sort of organic lines in black and white, probably poured straight from the can. Now, similarly, his number 27, which is also from 1950, is about 9 feet wide. The dominant configuration here is a jam-packed web of lines enlivened by subsidiary splatters and smears of color. The lines range from delicate tracery to thick ribbons. In this work, as well as in Autumn Rhythm and most of his other works, Pollock used no conventional perspective, no hierarchical arrangement, no light and dark techniques of shading to create form or depth, and he also includes multiple focal points. Many art historians describe such approaches as all-over painting or all-over compositions. Areas of the painting, yes, they are treated differently, but no one area is more important than any other, and there are no shapes, such as squares or triangles, to demand attention or differentiate one area from another. The uniform treatment of the canvas from edge to edge really invites the viewer to explore the entire surface rather than focusing on a single area. Now, Pollock, he drew inspiration from a number of sources. He was interested in Jung's theories of the collective unconscious, but he was also a big fan of the explosive improvisation of jazz music, and I think we can get a sense of that. Improvisation synthesized with a more structured approach and technique. He was also interested in Native American art, which he associated with his own Western roots. He was particularly intrigued by Navajo sand painting ceremonies, which had been demonstrated at the Natural History Museum in New York. But, as your textbook claims, Jackson Pollock was much more than the sum of his influences. So Lee Krasner was born in 1908 to Russian Jewish refugees in Brooklyn. She studied art at the Women's Art School and the National Academy of Design. She met Jackson Pollock through a friend, and in 1942 she moved in with him, virtually giving up her own artistic career to care for him. They married and moved to Long Island in 1945, where she kept a small home studio in an upstairs bedroom, producing small, tight, gestural paintings that became increasingly abstract, and really she reached completely non-objective, all-over compositions by about 1946, the same time that Jackson Pollock did. This untitled work from 1949 exemplifies the work from this period. She referred to these as her Little Images series because the canvases were small enough to fit on a bedside table. She envisioned these as unreadable hieroglyphics. She kind of creates a web of elusive forms, almost as if she was repeatedly tracing numbers or letters over and over again, sort of organizing them into a vertical grid-like fashion, which suggests a deliberate readable order, like some sort of decodable language, but it never truly becomes coherent. The rhythmic colors and lines retain a sort of manic mystery, seeming to struggle against or maybe vibrate within the overlying grid. One source notes that this painting may be based on Hebrew letters from the artist's childhood studies, but she's dissembled them in such a way that references this sort of scrambling of codes that was so prominent during the Cold War. Krasner's abstraction and her sort of rendition of the Hebrew language here could be read as a reference to the Holocaust, which, of course, for many represented the almost unimaginable horror, along with the atomic bomb, of contemporary life in the 1950s. After Jackson Pollock died in a car crash in 1956, Lee Krasner took over his studio and made a series of large gestural works, including this 1957 work titled The Seasons, that marked her re-entry into the mainstream art scene. Here, bold forces of nature are seen sort of bursting within these rounded forms and spring-like colors. And she's kind of expressing, it seems, this newfound sense of liberation. And then here's one more example of her work. This one's from a little bit later, from 1964, and in some ways it seems to be sort of a combination of the previous two examples. Krasner said, quote, "Painting for me, when it really happens, is as miraculous as any natural phenomenon." Born in the Netherlands, Willem de Kooning immigrated to the United States and settled in New York City in the late 1920s. There, he developed an energetic, gestural style combining the flattened and fractured forms of Cubism with the psychic energy of Surrealism and the expressive impasto and bold colors of German Expressionism. He became a leading member of the New York abstract expressionist movement with both non-objective and figurative abstract compositions. His approach was quite different than Pollock's, though. De Kooning wrote that, quote, "Art never seems to make me peaceful or pure," and he said, quote, "I'm still working out of doubt." His compositions, although they seem spontaneous, were much more structured and planned out. He would begin with preliminary drawings, which he cut apart and rearranged. Then he worked and reworked a painting, scraping away parts and beginning again, then applying quick strokes and cultivating unplanned effects, a process which he repeated until he'd achieved his desired effect. He retained many traces of the previous marks that show how he altered the positions of forms or how he changed his mind about the compositions. In this way, de Kooning's approach, though different than Pollock's, can still be described as action painting because it records the actions and decisions of the artist throughout the making process. Between 1950 and 53, de Kooning created a series of 6 figurative paintings of women in a bold step away from pure abstraction. So here we have 2 of these works, Woman Number 1 on the left and Woman and Bicycle on the right. Each presents roughly central in the composition the dismembered figure of a woman with flattened body parts camouflaged within a field of vigorous brushstrokes, slashing lines, and paint drips that really take on a life of their own and sort of confound both figure and ground. Woman Number 1 took him 2 years to complete, and his wife Elaine de Kooning estimated that he had scraped and repainted it at least 200 times before he was satisfied. The figure in Woman and Bicycle also appears to have been revised many times, as seen, for example, in this pair of grinning, toothy mouths, the lower of which resembles a necklace, and then also in sort of the rearrangements of black contour lines around the legs and feet. The traces of previous marks and arrangements contribute to the active surface and convey a sense of spontaneity or incompletion, as if the painting is still open to multiple possibilities. De Kooning constructs the female body in an incoherent, energetic, and even aggressive way. The huge, staring eyes and exaggerated breasts and hips recall various female archetypes, from ancient carved figures like the prehistoric woman of Willendorf, or maybe ancient Mesopotamian statuettes, ancient Greek and Roman sculptures, and all the way up to contemporary pinup girls and movie stars like Marilyn Monroe. The women in his works can be perceived as both sexual and threatening, like the femme fatale that we talked about previously. And many people interpret de Kooning's women as hostile, sexist, powerfully sexual, full of implied violence and intense passion. De Kooning himself said that they simply had to do with, quote, the female painted through all the ages, all those idols. Later adding, I wanted them to be funny, so I made them look satiric and monstrous, like sibyls. After visiting Pollock's studio in 1951, Helen Frankenthaler developed her own, more poetic variation of his drip technique. She, too, worked with raw, unprimed canvas on the floor in a rather improvisational method from all 4 sides, but her technique, which is sometimes known as stain painting, involved pouring washes of thinned paint onto the raw canvas, allowing colors to soak into and stain the fibers of the fabric, and really fusing the canvas and kind of the paint and eliminating that separation between surface and support. She also would often do things like maybe lift one corner of the canvas, kind of tilting it to move the color where she wanted. So really, her process was a combination of artistic control and then chance, often informed by gravity. Her finished stain paintings have an atmospheric luminosity enhanced by the tendency of the process that produces soft, fuzzy edges for areas of paint, and then also these halos of lighter shades around darker ones. Frankenthaler explained that she usually began with an aesthetic question or an image, which evolved as the self-expressive act of painting took over. She said, quote, "Sometimes I will start with picture or feeling. I think, what will happen if I work with 3 blues? And very often midway through the picture, I have to change the basis of experience. Or I add and add to the canvas. And when I say gesture, my gesture, I mean what my mark is. I think there's something now that I'm still working out in paint. It's a struggle for me to both discard and retain what is gestural and personal." For this work from 1952, titled Mountains and Sea, the artist first outlined selected forms in charcoal, and then she poured several diluted colors onto the canvas. She said the result reminded her of the coastal landscape of Nova Scotia, where she frequently went to sketch. Here's another work, a later work from 1964 titled Small's Paradise. By this point, Frankenthaler had switched from oil paint to acrylic, which absorbed into the canvas much more slowly, leaving fewer halos. She's used acrylic here to achieve a more intense color and sort of a colder or bolder composition. Here, abstract shapes of warm red and pink kind of cluster in the center, contrasting more expansive fields of cool greens and blues around the edges. Overlapping colors create subtle spatial effects, but not the illusion of three-dimensional space. Frankenthaler explains that her titles often come intuitively after the improvised shapes have emerged. For example, Small's Paradise here was named after a Harlem nightclub that she had recently visited. So while action painters like Pollock worked rather urgently using different improvisational techniques and they sought to record the physical processes and actions of making, other abstract expressionists moved in a different direction. Labeled as color field painters by Clement Greenberg in 1955, these artists avoided visible brushstrokes and other traces of the artist's hand while maintaining the interest in large-scale, self-referential abstract compositions. Color field painting encompasses artists who pour, spray, paint, or otherwise apply their paint in large, flat areas of saturated color in an all-over approach to produce more contemplative moods. Now, depending on the artist, the areas of color may be roughly layered and appear transparent, or they might be relatively smooth and opaque. Many pioneering color field painters were interested in the expressive and even spiritual power of color, and they wanted their large fields of color to overtake the viewer's consciousness and place them into a contemplative state. Mark Rothko was a leading color field painter who had very little formal art training. By the mid-1940s, he'd begun creating large-scale canvases, often with 2 to 3 rectangular shapes arranged in a vertical format. Using brushes and rags, Rothko applied thin washes of paint in numerous layers, allowing colors to bleed into each other and leaving the edges of the rectangles soft and indistinct. Works like these two, his magenta, black, green, and orange, and then his untitled number 506849. These are not just arrangements of flat geometric shapes on canvas, nor are they atmospheric, representative landscapes. Rothko really thought of his shapes as fundamental ideas expressed in rectangular form, uninterrupted by a recognizable subject, and these shapes or ideas sit in front of this kind of painted field. The resulting optical effect, especially in this particular work from 1956, Orange and Yellow, it's very sort of radiant. It sort of makes it seem as if the whole painting is kind of glowing or it's illuminated from within. And then the rectangles really seem to sort of float freely in space, sort of quietly rising or receding. Rothko was primarily interested in light, color, and emotionality. He once said, quote, "I'm not an abstract artist. I'm interested only in expressing human emotions." He emphasizes the emotional qualities of color, utilizing a variety of tones from the intense vibrancy of the orange and yellow on the previous slide to the more somber colors like these in 1952, blue, green, and brown, and then the 1959, lavender and mulberry. Rothko desired to create a transcendental viewing experience that promoted a kind of immersive, meditative state. He preferred to show his large, unframed canvases together in series or rows, hung relatively low to the floor and lit indirectly. He wanted viewers to experience them intimately by standing close to them so that the color would really swamp their entire field of vision. Another color-filled artist who also addressed modern humanity's existential condition with rather large-scale canvases and broad fields of color, he was Barnett Newman. He claimed his art was all about, quote, the self, terrible, and constant. Newman regarded this 1948 work titled One Meant One as the breakthrough that established the basic compositional formula that he used. His works typically feature a single, vibrant color field interrupted only by thin vertical lines in different colors, which he called zips. The nature of Newman's zips vary. Sometimes they are very straight-edged lines that he made with masking tape. Other times they're hand-brushed and more irregular. Sometimes he painted the background first, and other times he began with the zips instead. Either way, the zips are usually meant to imply an opening within the picture plane rather than simply a line on top of it. This 1950-51 work titled Vir Heroicus Sublimis, or Man, Heroic and Sublime, really exemplifies how Newman's total concentration on a single color focuses his meaning. The broad field of red describes no form, but presents an absolute state of sublime redness across a vast heroic canvas, only interrupted by zips that threaten to unbalance the work like a human flaw. Notice how the zips here aren't identical, but they sort of compete with one another. Some of them seem to hold weight, while others seem to fade away. The purpose of the zips is twofold. While they visually highlight the expanse of contrasting color around them, they also metaphorically reflect our own presence as individuals within our potentially overwhelming surroundings. Newman wrote, quote, "The present painter is concerned not with his own feelings or with the mystery of his own personality, but with the penetration into the world mystery. His imagination is therefore attempting to dig into metaphysical secrets. To that extent, his art is concerned with the sublime." So with this painting, he evokes the 18th century notion of the sublime, this philosophical concept related to spiritual understanding of humanity's place among the greater forces of the universe. But it also refers to Newman's own essay titled The Sublime is Now, in which he poses the question, if we are living in a time without a legend that can be called sublime, how can we be creating sublime art? So Newman was really trying to make a signature style, but at the same time, he, like other abstract expressionists, wanted it to also be about higher, more universal ideals. Like Rothko, Newman intended viewers to stand close to these works, only about 18 inches away, so that it would really envelop their entire field of vision, promoting a transcendent, emotional, even spiritual experience. He explained, quote, "It's no different really from meeting another person. One has a reaction to the person physically, and also there's a metaphysical thing. And if meeting of people is meaningful, it affects both their lives." Now, in general, abstract expressionism is found more often in painting than in sculpture. Sculpture tends to resist the kind of spontaneous improvisational techniques developed by these painters because a sculpture really has to be pre-planned so that its physical weight is balanced and it doesn't topple over. Some sculptors did, however, manage to communicate both abstractly and expressively in 3 dimensions, and perhaps the most successful of this era was David Smith. Smith enabled some improvisation techniques by placing shapes on the floor so that he could assemble them quickly and freely in visual patterns before attaching them together and then lifting the sculpture into a vertical position. A native of Indiana, Smith had worked as a welder in an automotive factory as a young man. He later trained as a painter, but transitioned to sculpture after seeing reproductions of welded metal sculptures by artists such as Picasso. After World War II, Smith began welding together pieces of found metal as well as his own shapes. He avoided traditional sculptural materials and instead embraced modern materials like iron and especially steel, writing, quote, "What associations it possesses are those of this century: power, structure, movement, progress, suspension, destruction, and brutality." For his 28 QB sculptures, the last series he made before his death, Smith extended his industrial approach by ordering stainless steel geometric shapes prefabricated in standard sizes from a factory. He then assembled the cubic shapes into a balanced composition and welded them together to create these geometrically abstract sculptures. In a more expressionist vein, he then marked the shiny stainless steel surfaces by scratching and burnishing them, creating very gestural marks. His preference to exhibit such sculptures outdoors allows the changing natural light to affect their appearance as well.